Alright class, greetings. So today I am not present, but you are watching this video so we can cover the stuff that we would have been covering in class if I was there. So you'll notice that today, of course, Thursday, August 31st, I had us set up to look at Chapter 2 of The Art of Summarizing from They Say, I Say. Look at Report 2, which we do after Report 1, which we looked at on Tuesday. Look a little bit closely at Chapters 7 and 9 of Scott McCloud, and then a reminder about posting your graphic novel selections to Moodle, which is up and operating now. We will get to that as a reminder here at the post at the bottom. Let's start by looking at They Say, I Say Chapter 2. So real quickly, if you remember, if you want to follow along with this one, you would go to the They Say, I Say corner, and then you would simply locate Chapter 2, which I have provided for you. So let's start with this one. Okay, so They Say, I Say Chapter 2, the moves that matter in academic writing. And this one is specifically talked about. So Chapter 1, we talked about like getting into the introduction and talking about joining a larger conversation. This time we're looking at the idea, her point is the art of summarizing. And this does relate in some ways to things you will end up doing both in your paper, but also something you will see a little bit here is going to be something you're required to kind of do for Report 2. So the authors point out in the text that to argue persuasively, you need to be in dialogue with others, and then summarizing others' argument is central to your arsenal of basic moves. So they go on here to sort of mention that there are some reasons why writers don't like to summarize. First of all, because they may not want to return to the text in question and argue with it, and sometimes they don't like spending their time on other people's ideas. But it is unfortunately something we do rely on. So we have some general rules here, and some of these a little bit overlap somewhat, but there's the idea that you're going to want to balance what the original author says with what you are saying. There is a need for you to be true to what the original author says. You don't want to misrepresent them because that leads us down that road into plagiarism. Also, there should be an emphasis on those aspects of what the author says that interest you as a writer, okay? And that's really what you're trying to focus on when you're summarizing. Typically, you summarize something for the main points, and usually you're going to want to be looking for main points that best fit whatever it is you're trying to do. And of course, trying to do that and striking that balance between what the author says and what you say is a little tricky. It's a little bit like a high wire act. But ultimately, the real crux of the whole thing is that you should respect the original text while structuring your words to support your own position. So you're going to take what someone else says, you're going to break it down to its main points, and you're going to rewrite it and express it to us without misrepresenting them, but within a focus in on whatever it is you're trying to say. So the idea here is a little bit like putting yourself in their shoes, okay? And Peter Elbow has a way of doing this. This is actually something we're going to return to because it actually works quite well when it comes to talking about counter arguments when we get to that section. But be willing to and able to suspend your own beliefs. And Peter Elbow there's an exercise called the believing game. This is where you try to inhabit the worldview of those whose conversation you are joining and whom you are perhaps even disagreeing with, and try to see their argument from their perspective. Generally, it's just a really good way of doing things in life sometimes. And keeping in mind that this is a temporary suspension. Now, we aren't going to do something with this right now, but we will return to this because this exercise is going to become even more useful for us down the road. Now, of course, when we don't undermine yourself, the not being able to play the believing game can undermine your argument and overexposing your bias and hurting your credibility. And of course, we want to try and keep an objectivity element, or at least a fairness element to what we're doing and saying. And again, this is going to become even more important to us when we look at Chapter 6. So we do have an example from the text. Now, this is what I would call a bad example. It says here, someone is summarizing another person's article, and they say, David Zinchenko's article, Don't Blame the Eater, is nothing more than an angry rant in which he accuses the fast food companies of an evil conspiracy to make people fat. I disagree because these companies have to make money. Now, first of all, this is a distorted view. In fact, you can find the full article in the book that I have for you on the syllabus. But of course, if you actually consult it, what you find out is that he never has an angry tone in his article or he never suggests a conspiracy either. And of course, what this is really showing you is not so much what David Zinchenko said. It's really showing you more about the writer who's writing this summary. And that's what happens when you don't play Peter Abel's believing game sometimes, and you let yourself get into a situation where you're in disagreement, and you've allowed this person here has obviously spoiled their own bias and by connection their own credibility. When also writing a summary, we also want to know where you're going. Okay, the trick here is to be aware of your own bias. Also, try to not let your bias become overtly or too obvious to your reader. The author's note to advise this advice to summarize authors in light of your own arguments may seem painfully obvious, of course, for some of us, but writers often summarize a given author on one issue, even though their text actually focuses on another. So you need to make sure that the things you're focusing on and summarizing also align with whatever it is you're talking about as well. And they go on here to talk a little bit more about avoiding the problem. What you'll want to do is to make sure that your they say, which is whatever it is you're summarizing, and your I say, whatever it is you're actually trying to say, are well matched. And what you're aiming to do is to make sure that you are being able to balance perceptions between theirs and yours. So what happens when you lose balance? Okay, this one of the things that can happen sometimes when you're summarizing is people fall into what are called list summaries. These tend to end up being nothing more, as it says here, an inventory of the original author's various points, but fail to focus those points around any larger overall claim. You might find yourself slipping into this if you find yourself continually using words and then also, and in addition, a little too much repetition. An example of a list summary. And if I were to read this to you, I could read this to you in a monotone voice like this. The author says many different things about his subject. First he says, then he makes the point that, in addition he says, and then he writes. I'm not going to finish that. But example here is that I might as well be reading that in a monotone voice to you, because that's what it comes off if you found yourself doing this. You're not really going anywhere with what's going on, right? And of course, they suggest Peter Abel's believing game can also help you in getting past some of this sometimes as well, because as it says here, it means doing justice to the source. If the summary ignores or misrepresents the source, its bias and unfairness will show. Now, one of the things we also want to stay clear of sometimes is this idea of try to avoid the bland formula of saying things like, she says, they believe. Now, we're not saying we have to ignore this, but we don't want to get too much into that, doing too much of it, because then it really does kind of get repetitive. And it says often fails to reflect accurately what is being said as well. And it's sometimes appropriate to use this phrase, of course, but consider how more tailored, lively language might better suit your paper. And of course, with all our chapters, we have templates. Templates for introducing summaries and quotations. She advocates a radical revision of juvenile justice system. They celebrate blank, he admits. All right. We also have some verbs for helping us to introduce and do certain things, like, for example, making a claim. We can say, if so, argue, assert, believe, insist, observe, claim, suggest, okay? If we're looking to express agreement, we could say acknowledge, endorse, collaborate, corroborate, celebrate the fact that, reaffirm. All right? If we wanted to express disagreement, complain, contradict, reject, refute, deny. All right, verbs for making recommendations: advocate, implore, call, forewarn, recommend, demand, encourage. Okay, and like I said, we're not going to hit the exercise this time. We'll actually come back and do something similar exercise-wise later. Now, the next thing I wanted to hit before we come back and hit the chapters from the cloud, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about Report 2. So like I normally do, assignments, I'll go find Report 2. Now, we talked about Report 1 on Tuesday. So remember, the information is here, and you should be working on this. And of course, you have your template. Now, the slightly different thing I did with Report 2 is we're going to step the game up. Now, Report 2, you do need to have your graphic novel. And you'll see here that Friday, September 15th is the deadline for this one. Now, I've got the template here, but it's going to work better if I actually, the template itself, and I've got an example of a summary analysis, because this falls into a couple different parts. And you need to pay attention very closely here to the formatting. So let's look at this. Okay, first of all, typical information. Now, this first section, you will be required to come up with a research question. Now, I'm going to post something about this as well. I will probably wait and post it Thursday afternoon or Friday, but I will be posting something suggesting how to begin working on coming up with your, and if I don't post it this weekend, it will definitely be posted next week, talking specifically about how we're going to move from that idea of the topic into the research question and then again into the thesis statement. Now notice something important that's highlighted here at the bottom of this page. It actually says make sure you begin the summary analysis begins on page 2. All right. So you'll notice that the next section does not begin until page 2. Make sure that you keep this formatting. Because on page 2, what you're going to then do is create a works cited entry for your graphic novel, and we'll talk more about this. And then you will create a summary and an analysis. And I've got some further information here. First of all, writing a brief summary of equal length to the analysis beneath, describing your graphic novel's text. Make sure to include one properly integrated quotation. So I'm going to want you to try your hand at that and make sure that is in MLA format. And then the other half of this page will be taken up by the analysis. Write a brief analysis of equal length to the summary above. So you want them to look representatively close in length. Specifically analyzing its value, and I'm referring here to the graphic novel, you think it might have with regards to a potential research question you are proposing. Make sure you include one properly integrated quotation. Now, we will elaborate more on this on Tuesday. But again, this one very specifically, keeping in mind that the way it looks here should be the way it looks when you begin typing it. And so I will entertain questions about this on Tuesday. But real quickly, I have an example here. Now, this heading part wouldn't be here, but this is an example of an article, and you'll notice that the summary analysis here are single-spaced. There's more than one quotation integrated, but I want you to see this specifically because I want you to note the way that the summary analysis, they only take up one page. And of course, you'd have a little bit more room because you wouldn't have that. And of course, this is actually old 7th edition here for the, but I've noticed I've got the works cited entry, summary, analysis. They're closely, roughly in length, and they exhort no more than one page. Okay, so that's something worth taking into account. Now, like I said, I will take questions more about this on Tuesday because I feel like we might need to elaborate a little bit more. But to wrap up, let's go ahead and have ourselves look at, and so I'm going to go to graphic novels, find the Understanding Comics chapters. I want to look at these last 2 PowerPoints here, Chapter 7 and Chapter 9. So let's start with Chapter 9. These will be our last McCloud chapters. So let's start with Chapter 7, and he talks about the 6 steps. We're going to kind of gloss over this one. It's Chapter 9 I really want to spend some time on. He talks about this idea about can comics be art? And so he talks so far we've mostly dealt with unique properties of comics, but there are properties of comics that comics share with other art forms. And so he gets into this idea of art, okay? And he talks about the purpose of art, the path that people often take when they create, consisting of 6 steps he gets into. I'm just going to gloss over these because I really want to talk more to you about Chapter 9. But first of all, the idea of purpose. First, and the impulses, the ideas, the emotion, the philosophy, the purpose of the work. This is what helps create the content. Of course, the second one he talks about is the form. What kind of form do we want to express our art? In case, book, chalk drawing, chair, and ultimately the idea of a comic book. So he's talking about larger forms of expression here. Third is the school of art, and this is the styles, genres, things that do apply to some of the stuff we do in writing as well. Then, of course, the fourth is the structure, putting it all together, what to include, what to leave out, how to arrange, how to compose the work. He goes on, of course, here. Of course, fifth is constructing the skills, practical knowledge, invention, problem solve, getting the job done, the actual crafting of something. And then, of course, 6 is the surface. This is when we get into the idea of how it will be presented, the exposure, how people are going to see whatever it is we're sharing, whether it be electronically or otherwise. And, of course, he talks about this, and I mentioned this idea of layers. Of course, this idea of working out from the idea, going outward towards the surface. And, of course, he's using this idea of the apple. He says here, one way to look at the layout of the steps is to view them as a kind of layered process. The process for the creator works from the center out. So this idea of starting with the idea and going to the surface. When doing your research papers, you may have to do an analysis. You are coming around to at the process from the reverse. So if you look here, I have drawn 2 lines onto his example here. Shown here are 2 arrows. Arrow 1 moving up and out, so that one coming from the idea, it represents the more traditional process of creation of a comic or graphic novel, while arrow 2, going inward, represents exposure or potential analysis approach one might be, of course, as well. So the idea of exploring a little bit more deeper. And then he gets into this idea about how there are multiple levels to this process. But that's a little bit more, not necessarily on base with what we're doing. So yeah, you can look over this. I would recommend in your own leisure time if you want to, but I'm going to stick more to what we're considering with what we're doing specifically in writing. And so, of course, you're going to have to analyze your graphic novel, so you may want to consider the fact that you're going to be approaching from that level of coming at things from that surface and trying to get deeper into that idea that's in the center. What I really want to get to, though, is chapter 9. This is where we wrap things up, okay? So he goes back to the beginning here and says, so why is the medium of we call comics so important? Why should we try to understand comics? And of course, there's that word again, sequential art. I think the answer lies deep within the human condition. He says we live in a state of profound isolation. And what if you wanted to modernize this picture, just imagine all those people having cell phones, smartphones. It's even more of a statement that is true today. And he says here, all media by communication are a byproduct of our sad inability to communicate directly from mind to mind. So since we don't have telepathy, how do I get that idea that's on this left-hand side here, here, into this person's brain here? Okay. Sad, of course, because nearly all problems of human history stem from this inability of creating that image. Okay. So each medium, the term comes from the Latin word meaning middle, serves as a bridge. So you see here the picture, there's the idea in the head, the spoken, it's heard, and there it is. So again, this is the communication via spoken word. He says the media convert thoughts into forms that can traverse the physical world and be reconverted by one or more senses back into thoughts again. So you'll see here thought, a pencil, writing, seen, or read, idea, written word. Here's another one, thought, presented in music, heard, and then here's with the film camera, the cinema, okay? So all these little steps that create that, okay? In comics, the conversion follows the path from the mind to the hand to the paper to the eye to the mind. So he's describing this path right here. Ideally, the artist's message will run the gauntlet without being affected by it, but in practice, this is rarely the case. So what he's saying here is that this idea here, reaching here exactly the way that this person originally conceives it, is a difficult thing. It's like playing a game of telephone. You start out and never know if the message on the other end is exactly the same as it was originally. So he says here that the comics I see in my mind will never be seen in their entirely by anyone else, no matter how hard I try. So he's basically acknowledging a reality here. Ask any writer or filmmaker or painter just how much of a given project truly represents what he or she envisioned it should be. You'll hear things like 25, 10%, 5%. Few will ever claim more than 30 sometimes. Now, that could be disputed. You never know. We have a lot of interesting technological advances we've made now with special effects. Of course, the mastery of one's medium, he goes on here to say, is the degree to which the percentage can be increased. So the more masterful an artist is, the better his chances of communicating what's in his mind to somebody else. And so it allows that idea to survive that quote-unquote journey. Or, for some artists, the degree to which the inevitable detours are made useful by the artist. As I said in chapter 7, I believe we all have something to say to the world, and I'm a firm believer in the inherent worth of all inner truths. There is only one power that can break through the wall that separates all artists from the audience, and that is the power of understanding. Understanding comics is a serious business. Today's comics is one of the very few forms of mass communication in which individual voices still have a chance to be heard. Okay? And a lot of commercialization, Time, NBC, Home Alone Kid. You're probably all too young for that. Those who tackle the business of comics have many obstacles to overcome, but they pale in comparison to what this filmmaker or a playwright has to contend with. So it's easier, he's saying, in a lot of ways to get into the comic business and express than, say, having to find someone to fund your film or put on a play production. Comics welcomes any writer or artist to step into a world of pen and, as close as a pen, pencil, paper, or computer screen. The vast examples can be found today of people who do their own independent web comics. All right. The wall of ignorance that prevents so many human beings from seeing the other clearly can only be breached by communication. And so here's that idea. You see this comic book shattering down a wall. Okay, communication breaking through. And communication is only effective when we understand the forms that communication can take. I've been trying to understand comics for about 15 years, and this was in 1993, so it's been a lot longer than that. And here's what I've come up with so far. First step in any such effort is to clear our minds of all the preconceived notions about comics. Only by starting from scratch can we discover the full range of possibilities of comics. This means learning to separate the form, comics form, from what is oftentimes its content. And that's what he's been talking about here. Okay? The best definition for comics will, I think, be the most expansive. With a little refining, such a definition can take comics far into the future, and there's that part of that definition, and far into the past beyond the artificial starting point of 1896 with the Yellow Kid. And he talks a little bit about this in chapter 1, going back to things like the Bayeux Tapestry and the Norman conquest of England in 1066. He's talking about how long it's really been around with us. And this is some other people quoting things, but I'm going to skip past that one. And here's where he talks a little bit about the attitudes of comics, and that sometimes people seem to think that if you're reading something of high literature, you're up there, while you're down here with crass consumerism and comic books. And that's what he's trying to sort of point out why this is the case. But he does go on to talk here about comics as a site-based medium. The whole world of visual iconography is at the disposal of a comics creator, including the full range of pictorial styles from realistic to the simplest cartoons. So if you see here on the left, the young woman, very realistic, owing all the way back here to a stick figure. And of course, sometimes even the abstract, which if you look carefully at this, I think you're supposed to see his little avatar. And the invisible world of symbols and language is also at the comic's disposal as well. Throughout its history, comics has harnessed the power of cartoons to command viewer involvement and identification. From realism to capture the beauty and complexity of the visual world, to going on to comics is a great balancing act. For example here, this is where he actually talks about all this little balancing between imagery and time and space and motion, some of the stuff we've been talking about. And then he goes on here to talk about the visual picture world and all this, and it's basically talking a little bit here about evolution, all the way back to the earliest pave drawings in 5,000 years ago. Today's comics do their dance with the invisible better than ever before, but the language of comics continues to evolve. And then this is where he gets a little bit here of a reminder of just how far it's spread, because first of all, comic books in Europe exist because GIs brought them there during World War II. And then he even goes on here to talk about how manga has been influenced by American soldiers being deployed to Japan, but particularly after World War II. So it goes on here, as comics grow into the next century, creators will aspire to many higher goals, and that rather than just simply appealing to the lowest common denominator. Ignorance and short-sighted business practices will no doubt obscure the possibilities of comics from time to time, as they always have. And so here's truth, fine art, literature, and there's that nice little money sign looking to eclipse like we had the other Monday. But the truth about comics can stay hidden from view forever and cannot stay for sooner, but sooner or later the truth will shine through. And so this is where he's wrapping up this idea of endless possibilities here, referring back to the things we've talked about, learn, and the ability to see. And this is the world of comics as I understand it so far. So that's where he sort of brings us full circle. So what I would like to point out to you guys for me is, particularly for Sunday evening, you need to make sure that you have your selection made, and you're going to go post this for me in Moodle. Now here is our Moodle course shell, and you will actually see that I have a comics forum set up for you with instructions. It says your job by no later than Sunday, September 3rd by 11:59 p.m. is to come to this forum and post your selected choice of a graphic novel for your research project this semester. So really all you have to do is go into this forum here. I'm going to click on it. Add a new discussion topic. And you would just simply, in your subject line here, all you have to do is type the name of the graphic novel followed by the artist and the writer. You don't have to put anything in the message, which I guess you could put the writer and the artist in the message and just put the title there. But I really would just want to make sure that your line here has nothing but, the subject line should probably have nothing but your title of your work. And then put the writer and artist in here, and then post it. So everybody should be responsible for posting their own version of that to this forum by Sunday night, and then we will talk about that on Tuesday as long, and also answer questions surrounding Report 2 and see where you guys are in Report 1, and I will have a new selection of stuff up for you guys from the calendar. Just real quickly, if you were to go check our course calendar, let's go ahead and just preview this for me right while we're here. We will talk thesis statements and materials, so we will also dig a little bit more into that summary analysis for Report 2, and we will probably definitely be looking very closely at, for purposes of moving forward, that whole discussion I was talking about with topic, question, research question, and thesis statement, which will be a part of Report 2. So I will see you guys on Tuesday.